Hey y'all, Mike here. You ever feel like a piece of shit taking someone else's intro? Because I do. Today we are saying the 30th president's name, also known as Calvin Coolidge, and I just wanted to say thank you all for listening to me for the 30th president. We're like almost there. We have like 15 or 14 more videos to go until, the next elections. But yeah, that's pretty much all we have left, and then after that we can go back to making actual content. And yeah, we don't have any comments today, but I will take this time to talk about how we have no taxes on products. Yeah, so I was shopping for some new shoes for when I go back to school, when I go to running or go to classes, and I got some pretty good deals on some Under Armour shoes. They were like 50% off, and the best part, no taxes. So it's like $40 for some kicks. Hey, how about that? But that being said, I don't think you have to pay taxes on items until August 8th. So, I mean, if you got anything you want to buy and you don't want to pay like $1, $2, $3, I don't know, maybe you're a little bit of a cheapskate, I think now would be a very good time. Anyways, enough of this financial support. Let's get into some presidents. So, Calvin Coolidge. He was born on the 4th of July in 1872. And yes, this was back when the 4th of July was celebrated as an actual holiday in Plymouth, Vermont, U.S. So this was I think it was 2 years after it was announced as a national holiday. So hey, pretty cool. He was an only child who graduated from Amherst College and practiced law in 1897. He entered politics as a Republican city councilman in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1898. In 1919, he captured national attention when he called out the state guard for stop disorder in the workforce by forming the labor union to press for better conditions and pay. Whenever I think of the union, I don't know if you guys have seen Shrek 2, but when you watch Shrek 2, they mention the union, and it's just, we're from the union. And that's where I can connect the dots and be like, hey, now I understand the joke. Anyways, he died on January 5th, 1933, Northampton, Massachusetts. And those were our 5 facts about Calvin Coolidge. So I'm going to go ahead and get the counter ready. And yeah, let's get this And I'm going to have to censor 2 things at the beginning. Sorry, notifications. I'm going to censor those with a steel pipe. So anyways, let's do this. Calvin Coolidge. 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 That's 10. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, 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 Calvin Coolidge. That's 20. Calvin Coolidge, 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 Calvin Coolidge. That's 30. Calvin Coolidge, 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 Calvin Coolidge. That is 40. Calvin Coolidge, 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 Calvin Coolidge. That is 50. Halfway there. Calvin Coolidge, 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 Calvin Coolidge. And that is 60. Calvin Coolidge, 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 Calvin Coolidge. And that is 70. Calvin Coolidge, 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 Calvin Coolidge. And that is 80. Calvin Coolidge, 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 Calvin Coolidge. And that is 90. Calvin Coolidge, 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 Calvin Coolidge. And that is 100. Thank you all for watching this video and listening to the audio, or using this video to figure out which president is which and which number and in order. But that's all I got for you. Tune in for the 31st president. And yeah, that's all I got for you today. So adios, because I gotta go hop on and play Fortnite with the boys. Adios.